Hey guys, hope all is well. Glad to be with you all on this Wednesday. A few really interesting things happened today, so I'm going to point those out before getting to the video. Um, First of all, I got all these notifications this morning on from my email, and it just seemed like there was a whole lot of subscribers that eventually just sort of piled on this channel and start to I guess subscribe and check it out. And I think it's because someone actually maybe shared my video within a Reddit channel, my previous video. I just want to say thank you to whoever did that, because I think it's really awesome that our this sort of community broadens. And yeah, I mean, my goal is essentially to just bring really high quality analysis to you guys, and yeah, the more people we can get on board, the better. So really appreciate that. I think it's a really beautiful thing. The second thing that happened that was pretty interesting was I got a message from a friend of mine who coaches chess out in North Carolina, and he told me he shared a picture of me. He shared a picture from New in Chess, in which they had some sort of they were discussing some opening lines, specifically in the Sicilian Taimanov, and one of my games, one of my victories, was cited against Strapunsky from 2014, which was super cool. It was definitely a game that I was proud of, and I had no idea, because I don't get New in Chess anymore, that was something that was part of the magazine. I don't know whether it was the latest edition of New in Chess or whether maybe it was a little while back. But I'm going to definitely try and find that out, and maybe I'll analyze that game at some point, because evidently I might have advanced the chess world's understanding or theory of that position. So that was pretty illuminating and pleasant surprise for me. And then last but not least, and probably the most important thing, and the subject of this video, the U.S. Championship started today. I'm not sure whether I'm going to do videos every day on the U.S. Chess Championship. I can't necessarily promise that commitment now, but I saw a game today that really stood out to me, and I mean, there were a bunch of draws, but there were two different games that were decisive, and one of them really stood out to me because it seemed extremely consistent with what we were talking about in the previous video, about the bishop pair and bishop versus knights. And so I basically wanted to go over that one. And so the game that I have before you is the game between Wesley So and Alex Shabalov from the first round of the U.S. Chess Championship. And yeah, without further ado, let's just get started. So c4, move 1. I think I've spoken about c4 before. It's a very flexible first move. There are a lot of transpositions. I'll leave it at that. c6, that's sort of, when you play c6 against c4, you're sort of indicating that you're willing to play a Slav. So Shabalov was willing to play the black side of a Slav, essentially. Or a Caro-Kann, because white can play e4 and then say, boom, Caro-Kann territory. But typically when the white player does play a non-e4 move on move 1, he's not looking to play e4 type of opening on move 2. So it's understandable that actually Wesley So went knight f3 in this position, which is sort of suggestive of the fact still keeping things flexible, but probably going for going to meet the Slav in a different way, or he's going to meet the Slav rather than playing an e4 opening. I also should point out, Wesley So has been really the hottest player in the game the past, 4 or 5 months. I mean, I still think Carlsen is the best player in the world. We can have discussions about this all day. But Wesley So hot right now. In fact, it makes me harken back to the movie Zoolander, if any of you guys have seen that. There's a really famous line in that movie where he's like, Hansel, so hot right now, Hansel. And I feel like Wesley So is like so hot right now. Anyways, Shabalov, on the other hand, good friend of mine actually. I don't know him super well, but I've hung around him a lot at different tournaments, most recently in Iceland, when Alex Shabalov, and some other Americans were playing in the not the Icelandic Open, the Reykjavik Open. That's the capital of Iceland, and yeah, he qualified for this tournament. He has a much lower rating by winning the U.S. Open, and he's had a penchant for this the past few years, winning the U.S. Open, qualifying for the U.S. Championship. So he's definitely not someone just to be messed around with. He's still got it. So anyways, knight f3, d5. Shabalov did in fact go for Slav, and then e3. E3 is a very flexible move. Typically, you'll see white play d4 here, and e3 just delay it. When you play e3, you're essentially delaying the playing d4, and you're hinting at maybe some other setups. So if black played a move like knight f6, which actually did happen, Wesley So could also aim for b3 and sort of delay the pawn on d2 going to d4, which would be somewhat interesting, because now the bishop on b2 would have a much longer diagonal to work with. As a matter of fact, I learned how to highlight squares today, so you can imagine the pawn not being on d2, you can have this diagonal sort of more open for the white bishop if this happened. But b3 was not played, d4 was played, and this now is essentially an e3 Slav after the move bishop g4. And the Slav with e3 is a very, very positional line. Typically, now black gets the bishop outside of the pawn chain, so that he has no bad pieces, and white has a little bit of a space advantage and usually secures the two bishops. And I thought this was particularly interesting given the fact we were talking about similar scenarios in the previous video on which I discussed bishop versus knight, or the bishop pair. So h3 was played, bishop f5 back was played. That's a move I haven't seen too much. I've seen bishop f5 right away, but I haven't seen the provocation of h3 making a big difference and then going back to f5. Shabalov must have had some nuance here, but I don't think it makes a huge difference, because now Wesley plays knight c3, a very logical move. And then after e6, actually now I think I might understand the nuance here, because in this position without h3, knight h4 is the most popular move. And now knight h4 doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because after knight h4 there's bishop e4, and this is the normal theoretical move with the pawn on h2. But the difference is here, normally f3 is played, and this would be sort of out of the question, because the knight on h4 is incredibly loose. So now maybe there's a nuance like, I don't know, like knight fd7, and all of a sudden this is a very, very weird to have played h3 and f3 and have this diagonal be so weak. So that's probably the nuance if I had to put a guess on it. But it doesn't make, so just to sort of illustrate that again, if h3 wasn't played right away and you have bishop f5 coming first, I'm sorry, bishop f5 instead of bishop g4, and then you don't have h3, there's knight c3, e6, knight h4, and then bishop e4, and then f3 here. And now the point is that if the knight moves somehow, like knight d7, it doesn't make any sense here, because there's just f takes e4, and after queen takes h4 check, there's g3 just blocking the queen, and now everything is protected, and white has the two bishops, and even an open f file to work with. But really, the difference between this and the previous bishop is that the king on e1 is relatively secure. That isn't the case in the line in the game. So after bishop g4, h3, bishop f5, knight c3, e6, and here knight h4 doesn't make as much sense, because you've already weakened the g3 square. And that's maybe important to point out, because again, I've discussed in the past, every single time you move a pawn, you're creating a weakness. You're leaving some square weakened, and that's typically where the ideas and stuff comes from. So we already see here h3 weakens the g3 square, So f3 is sort of a no-go. So because knight h4 doesn't have the same effect here as in the other lines, because h3 and then bishop f5 back, white played g4. And this is the other way that white can secure the bishop pair if black isn't sort of compromising with white and just taking on f3 right away. The point is that now if the bishop goes to e4, well, the bishop did go to e6, but if bishop e4 is played, again, knight takes e4 here doesn't make so much sense because black can recapture with the knight, and then there's bishop b4 check, and essentially the two bishops here is not going to be something that black will be able to sort of have to fight against for a long time, because you're going to have to play bishop d2 to block. So essentially, the bishop pair is not going to be as strong here because white won't be able to keep the two bishops. But the point is that if you play after bishop e4, you play g5 instead of knight takes e4. If you play g5 here, the knight on f6 has to move. And then if the knight on f6 moves after, like, let's say knight fd7, like we keep looking at, now knight takes e4, d takes e4, and knight d2, white is threatening to win a very important central pawn on e4, and more importantly, will in fact keep the bishop pair. So this is a sort of a big difference on the other lines. And I just want to point out here, yes, the g5 pawn is hanging, but central pawns are almost always more valuable than flank pawns. And so as a consequence, a position like queen takes d5 and knight takes e4 would be fairly ill-advised, because white would have a central pawn majority and, again, still retain the two bishops. Note that a move like bishop b4 check here, maybe trying to cause some havoc and saying, okay, well, maybe you won't have the two bishops forever, can be met in multiple ways. Include knight c3 is one of them, actually. Just sort of saying, you know what, I'm still going to keep my bishop pair, and I'm not sort of threatened by this exchange on c3 because it just bolsters my center. Additionally here, sometimes the bishop pair doesn't mean everything, and bishop d2 here is still a decent move, because after bishop takes, queen takes, the queen on g5 is still being threatened, knight d6 is a problem, and again, white is ready to castle queenside and has the open g file to work with if he so pleases. So again, these are all sort of, nuances, and again, many of these things were probably not even entertained too long by the players, but I think it's important to sort of point this out, because these are the things that we might actually mull over for a little bit. So yeah, so let me go back. So yeah, so that's why bishop e4 wasn't played, and after g4, bishop g6 was played. This was logical. Now, again, h3 and g4 is not entirely justified unless white ultimately secures the bishop pair, and that's why knight e5 is played. The point of playing this expansion is to secure the two bishops. And so now the bishop on g6, the light square bishop, will be taken. And again, note, bishop e4 here would make 0 sense because of, well, a few things, but actually, rook g1 might suffice. Maybe rook g1 might be good enough. Also, f3 is probably good enough, to be honest. And then the bishop would just go back, and then you'd get the two bishops. So yeah, there's a lot of nuance to the position. So bishop g6, knight e5, knight bd7 was played, and then again, now this knight on e5 is challenged, and so you take the bishop. Knight takes g6, and h takes g6. And this is probably the first sort of position of the game where it might be worth talking about, because at least the minor piece play is relatively set. The contours there are set. So with h takes g6, black does get a half-open h file, and as a consequence of that, typically delays castling in the structure. The reason for that is because you might entertain putting some pressure on the half h file. That also means that the black king on e8 might stay on e8 a little bit longer than usual. The other nuance in the structure is that typically white's king will also sort of wait to decide what black does with their king before doing anything. So typically black's next few moves are normally like bishop d2, moving the queen, and then thinking about playing castling queenside, or playing just rook c1, or bishop g2 and castling queenside. And yeah, you might say, okay, g4 has been played, but with the bishop on with the bishop on g2 fianchettoed, I'm going to make a color complex thing here. If the bishop goes to g2 and then the king castles, it's actually relatively secure. So that's important to point out. Now, the one thing that's sort of interesting about this position that doesn't normally happen in a ton of these positions is that it's white to move and black actually hasn't established this sort of wedge against white's queenside pawns. Typically, white would love to play this move pawn g5. So let's say white played a move like bishop d2, which is okay. Black plays g5 sometimes. And the idea is that this h3 pawn becomes backward, and essentially white isn't allowed to sort of get this really awesome expansion on the king side, because white already has a little bit of space on the queen side, so to also have expansion on the king side is not necessarily the most desirable thing. But the interesting thing is that it's white to move here, and this actually makes somewhat of a difference because now Wesley can throw in g5, and this is absolutely the correct move. Again, the reason for that is now you don't allow black to play g5, and moreover, you put the knight in a very uncomfortable position. So you might say, why not knight h5? You just keep the knight on h5, it stunts the advancement of the pawns, and it's all good. And even g5, the g5 pawn is attacked. Well, I'll tell you why knight h5. The reason you don't play knight h5 is because the knight actually becomes trapped on h5 when you do this. So it's extremely, extremely double-edged, and you really have to think twice about making this move, because now, again, the knight is trapped. And so white won't go f4 to defend this pawn, because that would allow knight g3 forking, and ultimately black would have the advantage there after this knight g3 move. But instead of playing f4, white would play h4. And the point is, again, this knight cannot move, and in the long run, you might have a situation where it's just 3 minor pieces versus 2 minor pieces. And that could be very devastating. As long as this pawn stays in f2, which it ultimately, I believe, can, that'll be a problem. And so you could see like bishop d2, bishop e2, rook c1, and white would just keep playing. Additionally, if you ever thought about castling kingside for black, white might just play bishop e2 and then just be able to gang up on the h5 knight and just win a pawn very easily. So again, that's why knight h5 is such a risky move and very double-edged. And Shabalov decided not to have any of that and went knight g8. Knight g8 does give the knight some prospects of going to a decent square. Like if black had a few moves and the knight got to f5, well, that wouldn't be so bad. That'd be a valuable outpost for the knight. I'm going to color that for a second too. But again, that takes time, this knight e7, knight f5 type stuff, and it's not sure whether you have that sort of time. So anyways, h4 was played. The g5 pawn needed to be defended, and that makes a whole lot of sense. And then black went knight e7, trying to get that knight to f5. But again, white does have the 2 bishops here, and white has more space, and so black has to move quick, because we spoke in the previous video about the idea that when you give up the 2 bishops, you're essentially going for a short-term plan. You're sort of staking out short-term plans. You can't really entertain having a better position lacking the 2 bishops in a position like this in the long term. You're essentially ceding the long-term advantages to white, and so as a consequence you have to do something in the interim before that becomes a real problem. And so it's interesting to see how Shaba tries to initiate that and whether it works out or not. So knight e7, bishop d2, like I said, this is typically where you put this minor piece. You just get a little bit closer to connecting the rooks. And then knight f5, all very logical, now hitting the h4 pawn. And this, you might say, well, the h4 pawn is maybe a touch backward or weak because it can't be defended by another pawn, and h5 can't be played because the g5 pawn would hang with queen takes g5, and then there still is a pin on the h file. But the truth of the matter is it can't be attacked so many times. So after h4, white just played queen g4, and essentially the pawn is protected, and it's very hard to attack it again. So no big deal. Now Shaba played a6. I understand why he played the move. It's a little bit of savvy prophylaxis against the b5 square. So if you think about where black's pawn break is going to come from in the middle, black does probably want to play something along the lines of d takes c4 and c5. So if a6 wasn't played, let's say d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and c5. And in some lines, the b5 square might be a little bit loose, might be a touch loose. And so perhaps you play a6 so that that's not the case. Because after c5 here, white could play d5, and that would be a very devastating move, opening up this diagonal. Note that e5 would be undesirable because you just give white a very clearly passed pawn. And if you played knight e5, which would be the move you'd want to play, forking the queen and the bishop, there's this bishop b5 check, which enables white to preserve the bishop and actually keep the king in the center, and king e7 would be so undesirable. So because of that, a6 is played first, with the idea of sort of covering the a6 square and preparing this dc. And again, black has to get something going, because if he doesn't, bad things will happen in the long term. So white played castles, and this is very interesting, because now we have a position where, okay, if you play d takes c4 and c5, this rook, which doesn't really look too menacing now, is lining all the way up against that queen on d8. And I'm just going to point that out for you. See that rook and that queen? They're both lined up so far. And you always want to be a little bit cautious when that happens, because as soon as this file clears, and we can see that action is on the C and D files right now, bad things can happen. So castle's very good move, very logical. And then Shaba went for it. He played d takes c4. The question is this sensible? Does it work? Is black ready to make this opening? You will have the answer in a few moves, so I'm just going to leave it at that. D takes c4, bishop takes c4, also helping the bishop develop. And let's just take stock at this position. White's king is castled. White's rooks are connected. White has more space. White has the two bishops. All of these trumps are in white's favor. So you really have to ask yourself if opening the position in this fashion is the sensible thing to do. Now, the flip side of that coin is, like I said, the two bishops is really a long-term advantage. So when black is trying to sort of open up the position, he's trying to get something going before it becomes an advantage that he can't really deal with. The issue is when you open up the position too, you're opening it up for white, and you allow white's bishops to flourish. And you just can see here that this bishop on c4 is starting to have some influence. So now c5 was played. Again, very double-edged, trying to pry open the position. The king on c1 might be a touch uncomfortable for now. The question is black ready for this push? Now, again, d5 here probably doesn't make as much sense as it did before, because there's this knight e5 move, forking the queen and the bishop, and probably does not make as much sense. But instead of d5, white can just play d takes c5. And again, we spoke about this a second ago. Now the rook and queen are just a little bit closer to being lined up against each other. And so after bishop takes c5, again, now black did develop this bishop, but Not doing so much on c5. It's in the way of the rook on c8 if it's trying to influence the c file. It's also on a diagonal where it's not really doing much. The f2 and e3 pawns are blunting. How do I do that again? Oh, no, not rook f1. The f2 and e3 pawns right here are blunting the c5 bishop, so it has not really great square for it, and it's going to have to move. Yeah. Now So played bishop e2. Very, very strong move, and just a very good understanding of what's happening. Now, you might say, why bishop e2? Why retreating? Well, the point is that knight e5 was going to be a threat, and so to keep the two bishops, sometimes you retreat and you just get them out of the fire of some other pieces, and so that's what that is. It's high-class prophylaxis. Also, it gets the bishop out of the way of maybe rook c8 stuff later. Now bishop e7 was played. A fairly sensible move in my opinion, because again, the bishop wasn't doing anything on c5, and there needed to be, the rook needed to really have full influence on the c file. But before looking at just bishop e7 for a second, I think it's important to point out that castling here, because of white's kingside expansion with the pawns, just becomes so ill-advised. Because now after castles, white has a ready-made attack with h5, and just prying open this h-file would prove to just be decisive in white's favor. So because of that, black can't really entertain castling kingside, and that really makes the position problematic. Because if you ask yourself whose king is safer, it's really white's king that's safer, right? Because white can just scoot to b1 and be fine, and black's king is sort of like not really, kingside's not really resolved. And the other thing is, if you decide to castle queenside, so let's say maybe black played a move like queen e7 here, which might be the sort of the best actually, or the least of the evils. The thing is that if black castles if queenside, let's say white plays king b1 and black castles queenside, white should just be safely better here, because white has the two bishops, and the kings are relatively equal in terms of safety. I might even argue that white's king is a little bit safer, but the point is black is not attacking the king in this sort of double-edged position the way that he should, giving up the two bishops, and so this ultimately becomes a long-term type of position where, again, white will have the advantage. So even though queen e7 might have been the lesser evil here instead of bishop e7, Shaba wasn't looking for a long, protracted game, and so bishop e7 was his choice because he wanted to get some pressure on the c-file. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out. King b1 was played. Again, always very good prophylaxis. Before going forward, sometimes you just want to sort of take care of your king and take care of your pieces. And the past few moves, he's demonstrated that. Bishop e2 and king b1 are both high-class prophylactic moves. Before you get on with your own things, sometimes you take care of some of the safety-first things first. Now, queen b6, logical move from the standpoint of at least entertaining castling queenside and sort of, getting the queen off the line of the rook on d1, which was the theme that was becoming problematic. Unfortunately, queen b6 fails tactically, and we're going to see why right now. Knight a4. This is probably a move that Shaba underestimated or missed, because it's very unusual that you move a knight to the edge and it's a good move, particularly when it's not about to capture something. But the issue here is that black really wanted to maybe connect his rooks or get something going, and there was no move for black where the queen was relatively safe. Like if you played queen a5, there was also going to be potential discoveries with the knight and the bishop against each other, so that was not really something that could be done. For instance, there could have been maybe knight e4 or maybe queen e4 and then knight d5. I don't know. My point is that there wasn't really a great square to go to. There would be unscathed. If queen c7, white may just go rook c1 and then threaten discoveries like this. So that's really something to point out. But the point is that after queen b6 and knight a4, the queen really doesn't have a great square to go to. You can't go to a5 anymore. You can't go to b5. In fact, I'm going to just color code all these squares. All these squares are taken away. So this whole radius, this whole area that potentially black would like to go to, it's just gone. And sort of a word of advice generally is if one side is controlling a 3 or 4 square radius like this, it usually is not a good sign for the opposing side. Even in the middle, like if I'm going to take away these colors. Even if there was something like this where one side controlled all of these central squares, that usually means that that side is the one that has the advantage. And if you look here, if we just do a really high-level analysis of the covering of squares, it's very clear that that white is the one controlling more squares, right? Like all these squares on the 4th and 5th ranks that white is actually controlling, and black is mostly playing on the last 3, and that's not a great sign. Really, really not a great sign. So keep that in mind when you're playing your own games. So, enough of me color coding. So knight a4 just really poses the question, what are you going to do with your queen? So queen c7 was played. I guess preserving the notion of maybe... I mean, honestly, I can't even say. It's not a great move because after rook c1, white is getting another move with tempo. And again, you have this problem now where after rook c1, black can never castle queenside. And we said castling kingside is like suicide because of h5. So black's king is just going to be stuck. And if that's the case, black's just in real trouble. So rook c1, queen d6 was played. And now bishop a5, another marvelously strong move, which just sort of demonstrates the domination here. The bishop now gets to a new... It had to move because it was attacked or be protected, and now it entertains... it has a new diagonal where it's influencing pressure. Maybe bishop c7 is an idea at some point. There's also rook hd1 is an idea, getting both rooks involved. And again, this queen is just not getting any peace. And to add insult to injury, this rook on a8 will now never get the c file because the rook is covering the file. So it just really is starting to unravel here, and black doesn't have many great moves. Knight e5 was played. Again, that was probably the only move that really sort of did something, and it does attack the queens. That's good. The problem is it doesn't really solve everything, and after queen e4, white is making a move with another threat, which is attacking the b7 pawn. And I understand why knight e5 was played. I think the point is to attack the queen, and more importantly, cover the c file by playing knight c6. Pretty much the only move to just stay in the game for a little while longer. And but the problem is, again, black's king doesn't really have any home yet, and white is way, way too active, and so continues in this vein by playing rook hd1. Extremely powerful move, which again asks the question of the black queen, where are you going? What are you doing? I mean, look at the whole 5th rank is just dominated by white pieces. Like all this rank is dominated by white pieces, and then you get to the 6th rank, and then there are more areas that are dominated by white pieces. And so it really is just not a pretty situation. And so after rook hd1, black did try the somewhat interesting rook takes h4, which I would say against players probably sub 2300, maybe they would have been a little bit rattled by rook takes h4 because you're losing a pawn, and g5 pawn is also hanging, and it's like might come as a shock to the system, like, oh my gosh, my queen is attacked, and I can't actually take on d6 because then black will take on e4. So if like rook takes d6, rook takes e4, all of a sudden it would be black that would be better because he would already be a pawn up, he'd be attacking the d6 rook, and the g5 pawn would still be hanging. The issue is that the really strong guys, especially at this level, really are calculating everything and making sure that they have things under control before going in for something like this. And this was explored, and Wesley found a really, really nice response, the move f4. The move f4 is wonderful for several reasons. Firstly, it covers the queen, right? That's a good first reason. That's the primary reason. That's the biggest reason it had to be played, or it had to be taken care of. Secondly, it covers the g5 pawn. The g5 pawn is protected by f4. Thirdly, it controls the e5 square. Really, really wonderful. So it protects the e4 pawn, covers the g5 square, also covers the e5 squares that, again, so that black can't actually go to e5 with the queen. Very key. And then fourthly and lastly, it does all those things and still keeps the threat on of the taking the queen on d6. So really just a monster move. And you see now the queen can only crawl back into its corner with queen b8. And look at the position here. I mean, already here, this could be resignable. Just the difference in pieces is extraordinary. And for a pawn, white's king is totally safe, and the pressure is still totally on. A move that's Wesley So played here, which I think really makes a whole lot of sense, and it's just easy to play. Knight b6. Further encroaching on black's side of the board and just threatening to win an exchange. So Shaba played knight d6, first attacking the queen. Now queen a4, not really bothered by this. The queen here is still on a very prominent post, pinning the knight, keeping the pressure on. All those things are great. And rook a7 was played, and it's just crazy activity here. And so now the coup de grace, bishop f3, beautiful. Such a picturesque position to me, just because all of white's pieces are in total harmony, and there's so much discord in black's setup. And Wesley probably could have done something a bit more spectacular. He maybe could have played rook takes c6, the previous move, and then like knight d7 check or something like that. But he's just keeping calm, cool, and collected because black has no coordination here and no prospect. Knight b5 was played, temporarily, I guess, covering the c6 area, but doesn't really do that much. Again, white could go in here for taking the knight on c6, but instead, queen c2 was played, which I think is just demonstrates remarkable restraint, but also shows just in how much disarray black's pieces are, because every move is just sort of, the sword is getting deeper and deeper into the chest. And now, again, bishop takes c6, check, and then with the queen takes c6 coming in next is devastating. So queen c7 was played, just defending against that. And again, white could have, some players might have just considered, oh, just win this pawn, bishop takes c6, then queen takes, and then come in with the two rooks. But there's just a much, much easier way to win here, which So plays and just demonstrates how alert he is. Rook d7, which again attacks the queen for, it seems like, the umpteenth time, like the fifth or sixth time with tempo, and just sort of devastates black's position. And it's here that black resigned on move 29. There's really nothing to do. If you play queen b8, for instance, just going back, white can simply play bishop takes c6, d takes c6, and then queen takes c6 should win on the spot. Among other things, really. I mean, you can play so many things after queen b8. It's honestly ridiculous. You don't even have to take on c6. You can try and strengthen the position somehow. The difference in activity here after rook d7 is so extraordinary. And look at how discombobulated the black pieces are. So, really good start for So. Shaba will be back to the drawing board, because I think his a6 and c5 idea, a6, d takes c4, and c5 idea was ill-advised, and ultimately black didn't really find the good counterplay or safe king. So yeah, the interesting thing about this line is that it's actually played a ton. This e3 Slav is actually one of my favorites to play with white. So black will definitely have to reevaluate playing in this way. So yeah. So anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you guys learned something from it. And yeah, if you like what you see, subscribe. You can even donate to the channel if you want. And yeah, thanks for watching.